What if I told you that a company built on a talking mouse now owns Star Wars, Marvel, Pixar, ESPN, a cruise line, a chain of theme parks on 4 continents, and one of the largest television networks in America? And somehow, all of that still isn't enough to guarantee a profit every year. In 2020, this same empire posted its first annual loss in over 40 years, nearly $3 billion in the red, while its parks sat completely empty. Yet today, it is one of the most valuable media companies on the planet, worth well over $200 billion. So how does a company built around cartoons become one of the most complicated business machines in the world? And why does something that owns half of pop culture still struggle to keep its stock price happy? I wanted to find out, so today we are digging into one of the most fascinating conglomerates in modern business, the Walt Disney Company. Let me take you back to March of 2020. Walt Disney World in Orlando had just closed its gates for the first time since the day it opened in 1971, aside from a handful of hurricanes. Cast members walked through empty streets that were normally packed with 60,000 guests a day. Cruise ships sat docked with no passengers. Movie theaters across the country went dark, which meant every film Disney had scheduled for release that year was suddenly worthless on paper. Executives who had spent years building out a streaming service to compete with Netflix now found themselves relying on that same service just to keep any revenue coming in at all. It was, in a strange way, the ultimate stress test for a business that many people assumed was untouchable. And it forced the entire company to answer a question it had never really needed to ask before. What happens when the magic stops making money? To understand how Disney survived that moment, and how it makes money in a normal year, we need to follow the business the same way we would follow any company. Piece by piece, division by division, dollar by dollar. Disney reports its business in 3 main segments, and thinking of them like 3 different companies stitched into one really helps make sense of the whole picture. The first segment is entertainment, which includes the movie studios, the television networks like ABC, and the streaming platforms like Disney Plus and Hulu. The second segment is experiences, which covers the theme parks, resorts, and cruise line. The third segment is sports, which is mostly ESPN. Together, these 3 pieces generated roughly $91 billion in revenue in a recent fiscal year, which puts Disney in the same league as some of the largest technology companies in the country, except this company also happens to run castles and roller coasters. Let us start with the piece most people think of first when they hear the word Disney, which is the movie studio. Walt Disney Studios includes Walt Disney Animation, Pixar, Marvel Studios, Lucasfilm, and 20th Century Studios. On paper, this looks like it should be the crown jewel of the entire company, and for a long time it was. A single successful Marvel movie can pull in over $1 billion worldwide, and a Pixar film can do the same while also selling millions of dollars in toys, backpacks, and lunchboxes for years afterward. But here is the part that surprises a lot of people. The movie studio is actually one of the smaller pieces of Disney's overall revenue. Box office ticket sales alone are a relatively thin slice of the pie once you account for the massive cost of making and marketing a blockbuster, which can easily run past $200 million before a single ticket is sold. The real value of the studio is not just the box office weekend. It is everything that comes after. That is where we get to one of the most important ideas in Disney's entire business model, something former CEO Michael Eisner used to call the flywheel. The idea is simple. A movie is not just a movie. It is the starting point for a chain reaction across the entire company. A hit film becomes a ride at the parks. It becomes a costume at the Disney store. It becomes a show on Disney Plus. It becomes a cruise ship stateroom themed around its characters. It becomes a video game, a soundtrack, and a Halloween costume sold at Target. Every single piece of that chain generates its own revenue. And every piece also drives more attention back to the original movie. This is why Disney spent so much money buying up other studios over the past 2 decades. In 2006, they bought Pixar for about $7.4 billion. In 2009, they bought Marvel for about $4 billion. In 2012, they bought Lucasfilm, the home of Star Wars, for about $4.05 billion. And in 2019, they bought most of 21st Century Fox for over $70 billion, bringing in franchises like Avatar and The Simpsons. Each of these deals looked expensive at the time, and some analysts even questioned whether Disney was overpaying. But when you understand the flywheel, you start to see why Disney was so willing to spend. They were not just buying movies. They were buying decades worth of characters that could be turned into rides, merchandise, and streaming content for generations. Which brings us to the segment that actually makes the most money for Disney year after year. And it might surprise you that it is not the movies at all. It is experiences, which is the parks, resorts, and cruises. This segment regularly accounts for the largest share of Disney's operating income, even though it makes up a smaller share of total revenue than entertainment. The reason is simple. Once you build a theme park, the profit margins on actually running it are enormous. A family visiting Walt Disney World is not just paying for a ticket. They are paying for parking, a hotel room on Disney property, character dining experiences, souvenirs, a Genie Plus upgrade to skip lines, popcorn buckets shaped like spaceships, and 100 other small purchases that add up throughout a single day. Disney has become remarkably skilled at designing park experiences that naturally lead guests towards spending more money at every turn. From the layout of the gift shops at the exit of every ride, to the pricing tiers on tickets that change depending on the day you visit. A single-day ticket at Walt Disney World can now cost well over $100 per person before you have spent a single additional dollar inside the gates. Multiply that by a family of 4 staying for a week, and you start to understand why this division alone can generate tens of billions of dollars a year. The parks also come with a completely different cost structure than the movie business. A theme park does not need a new blockbuster budget every quarter. Once the infrastructure is built, the ongoing costs are mostly staffing, maintenance, and utilities, along with occasional investment in new lands and attractions. That is why the return on a successful theme park expansion, like Star Wars Galaxy's Edge or the newer Zootopia land in Shanghai, can pay off for decades rather than just one opening weekend. This is also why Disney has continued investing tens of billions of dollars into expanding its parks worldwide, even during years when the studio side of the business was struggling. Now let us talk about the segment that has honestly given Disney the biggest headache over the past several years, and that is streaming. When Disney Plus launched in November of 2019, it was framed as the future of the entire company. Bob Iger, who was CEO at the time, made it clear that streaming was going to be the primary focus going forward, even if it meant taking a financial hit in the short term. And that hit turned out to be massive. Building a streaming platform from scratch, licensing back content, producing new original shows, and subsidizing subscriber prices to grow quickly all cost an extraordinary amount of money. At its peak, the direct-to-consumer streaming segment was losing well over $1 billion in a single quarter. For a company that prides itself on profitability, that kind of sustained loss set off alarm bells among investors and led to plenty of tough questions on quarterly earnings calls. But the logic behind those losses actually connects back to the same flywheel idea. Disney was not just trying to build a streaming app, it was trying to make sure it owned the direct relationship with its customers, rather than relying entirely on movie theaters, cable providers, or other companies to distribute its content. Streaming also gave Disney a place to put Star Wars spin-offs, Marvel series, and Pixar shorts that might not have justified a full theatrical release, while still keeping those franchises active in the public conversation. It took years, plenty of price increases, and a serious effort to cut costs. But Disney has since managed to turn its streaming business from a massive drain into a profitable division, a shift that Bob Iger specifically prioritized after returning as CEO in late 2022. That return itself is a story worth mentioning. Iger came back after his successor Bob Chapek faced criticism over streaming losses, park price increases, and public relations missteps, which shows just how much pressure even a company this large faces when its numbers stop lining up with expectations. Then there is ESPN, which operates almost like its own separate business inside the larger company. Sports broadcasting works on a completely different model than movies or parks. ESPN makes the majority of its money through carriage fees, which are payments that cable and satellite companies make to include ESPN in their channel lineups, along with advertising revenue during live sporting events. For decades, this was an incredibly reliable source of income, because ESPN could count on nearly every cable subscriber in the country paying a monthly fee whether they watch sports or not. But as more Americans have cut the cord on traditional cable, that guaranteed revenue has started to shrink, and Disney has had to adapt by pushing ESPN towards streaming as well, including a standalone ESPN app aimed at reaching fans who no longer subscribe to cable at all. Sports rights themselves are also becoming more expensive every year, since ESPN competes with other networks and streaming services for exclusive deals to broadcast leagues like the NFL and college football, which means costs keep climbing even as the traditional subscriber base keeps shrinking. So if you put all of these pieces together, you start to see why Disney is such a strange and fascinating business to analyze. It is not really one company. It is 4 or 5 different businesses, each with its own economics, stitched together under one brand and one stock ticker. The parks behave like a real estate and hospitality business. The studio behaves like a hit-driven gamble, where a handful of successes need to cover the cost of the misses. Streaming behaves like a technology subscription business that took years to become profitable. And ESPN behaves like a media distribution business that is fighting to stay relevant as viewing habits change. Very few companies in the world try to run all of these types of businesses at once, and even fewer manage to make all of them work together. This also explains why Disney's stock price can swing so dramatically, based on news that seems completely unrelated on the surface. A disappointing opening weekend for a Marvel movie can shake investor confidence even if the parks division just posted record profits. A price increase at the parks can boost quarterly earnings even while the studio is having a rough year. Everything is connected, yet everything is also judged somewhat independently by Wall Street, which creates constant pressure across every part of the business at the same time. So is Disney actually a good business? Just like with Formula One teams, the answer depends on which piece you are looking at. Owning the Parks and Experiences division on its own would make for one of the most profitable and stable businesses in the entire entertainment industry. Owning ESPN by itself would be a solid but slowly shrinking cable business. Owning the movie studios alone would be an unpredictable, hit-driven gamble that could either mint billions or waste hundreds of millions on a single bad summer. And owning Disney Plus by itself for the first several years would have looked like a company hemorrhaging cash with no clear path to profit. It is only when you combine all four of these pieces into one flywheel that the entire thing starts to make sense as a long-term strategy rather than a scattered collection of unrelated bets. That flywheel is also exactly why Disney keeps buying things. Every major acquisition, from Pixar to Marvel to Lucasfilm to Fox, was really a bet that new characters and stories would keep feeding every other part of the machine for decades into the future. A Star Wars movie made in 2015 is still generating money today through park attractions, streaming shows, toys, and video games nearly a decade later. That is the kind of long-tail value that makes a $7 billion or even a $70 billion acquisition look reasonable over a long enough timeline, even if it looks painful on the balance sheet in the short term. Looking toward the future, Disney is leaning even harder into a few key growth areas. Continued expansion of its parks overseas, particularly in Asia, remains a major focus, along with new cruise ships designed to capture even more of that high-margin experiences revenue. On the streaming side, Disney has been bundling its services together with Hulu and even exploring partnerships with competitors like Warner Bros. Discovery to create combined streaming packages, a sign that even massive companies are starting to realize that consumers are growing tired of paying for a dozen separate subscriptions. And across the entire company, there has been a renewed focus on cutting costs and improving efficiency after the streaming spending spree of the early 2020s, with billions of dollars in cost savings targeted across content production, marketing, and corporate overhead. So could a company be built like this today, starting from scratch? Almost certainly not. The barriers to entry are almost unimaginable. You would need decades to build brand loyalty strong enough that parents already trust your name before their child is even born. You would need billions of dollars in acquisitions just to assemble a content library capable of feeding a park, a streaming service, and a merchandise business all at once. You would need physical land holdings across multiple countries, broadcasting rights to major sporting leagues, and the kind of scale that lets you absorb billion-dollar losses in a bad year without collapsing. Disney did not build this machine overnight. It built it over a century, one acquisition, one theme park expansion, and one franchise at a time. Which brings us back to that empty park in March of 2020. The very fact that Disney could survive a year where its parks sat closed, its movies had nowhere to premiere, and its cruise ships sat empty, and still come out the other side as one of the most valuable media companies in the world, tells you almost everything you need to know about why this business works. It is not because any single part of Disney is unbeatable. It is because the pieces are built to lean on each other when one part stumbles. A mouse alone could never have built an empire this large. But a mouse connected to a flywheel of movies, parks, streaming, and sports just might be one of the smartest business ideas in entertainment history.